This video is about Ibn Taymiyyah, and it is a book review of a recent work by Professor Jon Hoover, who is Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Nottingham here in the UK. Now, I have read this and I feel a bit foolish, to be honest, because Ibn Taymiyyah was an extraordinary human being on many, many levels. And his thought, his writing, his activism, his life covered so many topics and issues that are still reverberating with us today that I can't hope to even begin to scratch the surface in just a few minutes. So I'm going to give a few snapshots, a few insights into his thought based on this book. And I've highlighted several passages which I just want to share with you, which I think are very interesting from the human level, in terms of his personality, but also in terms of his theology and his understanding of Islamic law and so on. So this book, as I say, is published recently as part of a series devoted to significant men and women throughout Islamic history who've contributed to political, intellectual, and religious issues in the Muslim world. And the book itself says it is the first book-length academic introduction to Ibn Taymiyyah in English, which is quite a statement. The pace of research on Ibn Taymiyyah has quickened over the past few decades, and the time is ripe for a synthesis. So this particular book is recommended on the back cover by, for example, Frank Griffel, who's Professor of Islamic Studies at Yale University, who says, finally, Ibn Taymiyyah gets his first critical introduction in a Western language, and a really good one, it says. And there are other rave reviews from Western academics. Who is Jon Hoover, by the way, the author? Now, there are some YouTube videos featuring him. He is a specialist in the thought and life of Ibn Taymiyyah, probably Britain's leading specialist in that area. He's not a Muslim, I think. If you look at his CV online, it says he attended the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, which is in the United States, in Indiana. Apart from getting a PhD in Islamic studies from the University of Birmingham and so on. And he obviously is fluent in Arabic. So I suspect that he is a Christian and not a Muslim. But he writes with great professionalism, great academic objectivity, but I don't think he sympathizes with a lot of what Ibn Taymiyyah has to say, from what I can sense of the tone of his writing. But by the by, he's very objective. So I just want to share with you then, as I say, a few little snapshots. That's all I can do in the time available. And I do recommend this book. It's very well written. It's readable, which is not always the case with academic books. So on page 6, Jon Hoover tells us about the appearance, character, and personal relationships of Ibn Taymiyyah. And this is a fascinating insight into Ibn Taymiyyah, who, by the way, lived from 1263 AD to 1328 AD. And he spent most of his life in Damascus, which is in Syria today, and was one of the most prominent and controversial Islamic scholars of his day. And he called for jihad, famously against the Mongol invaders of Syria, who were nominally Islamic. And he called for a pretty fundamental reform of the practice of Islam in terms of law, in terms of shrine worship, in terms of Sufism, in terms of the Asharite theologies dominant in the day. He tackled and confronted many of these belief systems in the name of a purer original Islam, going back to the Quran, the Sunnah, and the practice and views of the Sahaba, the companions of Muhammad. So back to the appearance of Ibn Taymiyyah, it says, was a formidable figure. His prominent contemporary and erstwhile colleague, Shams al-Din al-Dahabi, depicts him as follows. And this is a contemporary of Ibn Taymiyyah, and translating this into English, who said this about him. He is loved by scholars and persons of piety, soldiers and emirs, merchants and people in authority. The rest of the common people love him because he stands up for their benefit night and day in his words and his writings. As for his courage, proverbial tales are told of it, and in some of them he resembles the greatest heroes. Vehemence possessed him when he worked as if he were a fighting lion. He was frequently tactless and argumentative. May God forgive him. He was poor, having no money, and his clothing, like any other jurist, was a wide robe, a long coat, a turban worth 30 dirhams, and cheap shoes. He had short hair. His figure was daunting. His grey hair was sparse. His beard was round. His complexion was between fair and the colour of grain. He was of medium height, and it was as if his eyes were two eloquent tongues above his shoulders. What an extraordinary bit of poetry there. His eyes were two eloquent tongues above his shoulders. He led people in the longest of prayers, bowing and prostrating. Sometimes he would get up to greet a person who had arrived from a journey, and sometimes he would turn away from him. When he arrived somewhere, people sometimes rose to greet him. But for him, it was all the same because he was unconcerned with formalities. He never bowed to anybody, restricting himself to greeting, shaking hands, and smiling. He might honor his companion on one occasion and then offend him repeatedly in dispute on other occasions. End quote. So al-Dahabi presents a mixed picture, writes Jon Hoover. On the one hand, Ibn Taymiyyah is popular, courageous, devoted to religious practice, and modest in attire. Laudatory biographers such as Ibn Abd al-Hadi underline the valiant and devout side of Ibn Taymiyyah, and they portray him as faithful to a Hanbali ideal of moderate asceticism and piety. He did not clothe himself in rags like extreme Sufis who wish to accentuate their poverty, nor did he wear luxurious clothes that would draw attention to himself. He was generous and little concerned for food or money. He was dedicated to performing his prayers and supplications to God. On the other hand, al-Dahabi describes Ibn Taymiyyah as sometimes irritable, contentious, and rude. Other contemporary biographers depict these aspects of Ibn Taymiyyah's character in a heroic light or gloss over them. Ibn Taymiyyah never married. Islamic law and the Hanbali ascetic prescribe marriage, but the biographers neither criticize nor explain this lapse in Ibn Taymiyyah's devotion. Celibacy was not unheard of in medieval Islam, and Ibn Taymiyyah may have sacrificed marriage for the benefit of his scholarly vocation. So that's a fascinating insight into a very human figure, warts and all, shall we say. I'm next going to skip to the section called Worship and Law in chapter 4, which gives an insight into the central concern of Ibn Taymiyyah's writings. Jon Hoover writes, in the previous chapter, we explored Ibn Taymiyyah's two principles of worship of God alone and worship by means of God's law, that's the Islamic law, and his distinctive concern for ethics in the face of challenges posed by Sufi and Ash'ari ontologies. This chapter expands on the second principle by taking a closer look at the content of worship. So what is worship for Ibn Taymiyyah? So for Christians, when I was a Christian, worship was what you did in church. You prayed to praise Jesus in church, or maybe sometimes in private devotions or in Bible studies. Well, what does Ibn Taymiyyah, how does he characterize and understand worship? In what follows, in the following text, Ibn Taymiyyah outlines what worship includes, which is much more than simply religious ritual. And this is quoting Ibn Taymiyyah. Worship is a term encompassing everything that God loves and is well pleased with, both words and deeds, both hidden and manifest. It includes ritual prayer, alms, fasting, pilgrimage to Mecca, truthfulness in speech, discharging trusts, honoring parents, relating to relatives, fulfilling pledges, commanding the right and prohibiting the wrong, struggling against the unbelievers and hypocrites, beneficence to the neighbor, that's charity, good works to the neighbor, the orphan, the poor, the traveler, slaves and animals, supplication, remembrance of God, recitation of the Quran, and such like. Likewise, a love of God and his messenger, fear of God and turning to him, consecration of religion to him, patience with his ruling, thanksgiving for his graces, good pleasure with his decree, complete trust in him, hope in his mercy, fear of his chastisement, and such like. So this is worship for Ibn Taymiyyah. Basically covers everything in a devout Muslim's life that they do for the pleasure of God. And there's a lovely description there of the devout life. Another snippet I want to share with you from page 59 of the book is entitled Worship Rituals Lawful and Innovated. This whole idea of innovated practices and Ibn Taymiyyah's trenchant criticism of them is key to his writing, I think. So I'll just read what Jon Hoover says. Sufi spiritual disciplines and the Sufi cult of the saints had gained wide popularity and public prominence in Egypt and Syria by the end of the 13th century. I spoke to a friend of mine just the other day about this, and the cult of grave worship and the prayers and so on at the graves is still very common in the Muslim world, from the Arab world all the way through to Indonesia. One common Sufi devotional practice was the spiritual concert, Sama, S-A-M-A, which included playing musical instruments, clapping hands, and dancing to promote ecstatic mystical states. Ibn Taymiyyah relates the following account of his own experience of a spiritual concert. And this, I think, is very illuminating in terms of his own personal experience and how he came to have a problem with this kind of practice. Ibn Taymiyyah says, in the earlier part of my life, I found myself with a group of adherents of asceticism, worship and will, i.e. Sufis, who were among the best of this kind. We passed the night somewhere. They wanted to perform a spiritual concert and they wanted me to participate with them. I refused to do that. So they arranged a place for me off to the side and I sat there. When they were performing their spiritual concert and ecstasy and mystical states overtook them, the Grand Sheikh called out to me in his ecstatic state. He said, "You over there, a great fortune has come to you. Come, take your fortune." I said to myself, and then to them openly, when we had regathered, "You can have this fortune. I will not partake of it, as it does not come via the path of the Prophet Muhammad ibn Abd Allah," that is Prophet Muhammad. It became clear to those among them with awareness and knowledge that others among them were Satans and others drunk with wine. The meaning of what I had said is that the cause of this fortune, in inverted commas, this gift, this present, this mystical state, is not lawful, writes Ibn Taymiyyah. It is not an act of obedience to God and his messenger. The messenger did not legislate it. It is like someone saying, "Come, drink wine with us, and we will give you this money," or "Venerate this idol, and we will give you authority over this province," and such like. That's end quote. And Jon Hoover continues, this account shows that Ibn Taymiyyah spent time with Sufis, at least early in his life. He was well acquainted with their practices. Perhaps he had even participated in such rituals before. Yet on this occasion, he chose to withdraw, and he condemns this kind of spiritual concert as falling outside the law of God. The fortune offered by the Grand Sheikh came from dubious sources, says Jon Hoover. What should we look at now? There's so much here. He criticizes grave visitation and intercession on the grounds that we should be supplicating to God alone. There is It's a bit here about Sufism, because I had thought, perhaps wrongly, that Ibn Taymiyyah was just against Sufism, and in my experience, Salafis today just are very dismissive of Sufism per se. But it doesn't appear to be Ibn Taymiyyah's position in that simple way. It seems to be more nuanced, I think. And this is what Jon Hoover has to say on page 72 about Ibn Taymiyyah. A more illuminating approach to the question is Ibn Taymiyyah's legal assessment of Sufism, legal in terms of Islamic law. In a short treatise on Sufi origins, he says that the term Sufi became well known only after the first 3 Islamic centuries. Sufis first appeared in the Iraqi city of Basra, which was known for extremes in asceticism and piety. There was even a story of people swooning and dying from listening to the Quran. Ibn Taymiyyah explains that the Basrans, out of their intense experiences, exercised independent reasoning, that's ijtihad in Arabic, to derive rulings concerning worship, just as their neighbors in Kufa exercised independent reasoning in matters of governance. Certain Basran rulings deviated from the guidance of the Quran, the Prophet, and the Salaf, and this led to controversy. Some criticized the Sufis as innovators, while others praised them as the best of people after the prophets. Ibn Taymiyyah commends a more discriminating assessment. In other words, he's more discerning, says Jon Hoover. Sufi independent reasoning based on intuitive inspiration, ilham in Arabic, may at times be superior to weak methods used by some jurists. Independent reasoning brings some Sufis closer to God, while it leads others into error and disobedience. Some innovators, like Al-Hallaj, who died in 922 AD, who was crucified for heresy. Other Sufis, such as Al-Junaid, died 910, and Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, who's very popular today, stayed within the bounds of the Islamic law. For Ibn Taymiyyah, Sufism is ultimately the product of meritorious independent legal reasoning. It is correct as long as it stays within the limits of the revealed law. Yet Sufi independent reasoning sometimes produces errors, innovations, and unbelief. So I think for Ibn Taymiyyah, as long as it stays within what is the Sunnah of the Prophet and the Islamic law, Sufi practices are acceptable. But if they go outside of that, then they obviously are innovated beliefs and are not acceptable. There's a marvelous chapter here in Jon Hoover's book about the controversy about a particular Bible verse, Quran verse, God is sitting over the throne. What does this mean? People have interpreted it literally, some have interpreted it metaphorically, huge arguments over the centuries. It can seem a rather obscure subject for modern people to try and get their head around. But it actually is a very interesting discussion. There's a point here for people who know about these issues. Jon Hoover says, it's important to understand that Ibn Taymiyyah rejects literalism as a theory of meaning. It is technically incorrect to call Ibn Taymiyyah a literalist, as is often done. He's not, he's a much more sophisticated thinker than that. And I think just to conclude now, because I could just go on, well, I could read for this for hours. There's so much intellectual meat in here for to feast on. But the danger is it just gets overwhelming. And I do recommend you read this for yourself. I just want to read the last few paragraphs from the book called The Epilogue. This is like an afterword where he concludes really some thoughts on Ibn Taymiyyah in the modern world, because his thought is still having a powerful influence on Muslims all over the world. In the modern period, Ibn Taymiyyah's writings on theology and innovative practices have inspired reform movements of diverse kinds. These include the Puritan Wahhabis in Arabia. I don't like that expression, by the way, but this is a Western academic. These include the Puritan Wahhabis in Arabia from the 18th century onward, Salafi reform initiatives in South Asia and the Arab world beginning in the 19th century, and the contemporary global Salafism movement that originated in Saudi Arabia in the 1960s. Salafis are among the most avid readers of Ibn Taymiyyah today. They adopt Ibn Taymiyyah's theological framework over against Asharism, which is the dominant school, I suppose, in Islamic theology. But they are not always comfortable with his views on more controversial issues, such as the duration of hellfire and the Prophet's protection from sin and error. We haven't covered those here. You can read about them in the book and elsewhere. In addition to the Salafis, modernists and revivalists have drawn on Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, I didn't know this, by the way, that modernists have also utilized aspects of his thought to their own ends. Modernists have drawn on Ibn Taymiyyah to present visions of Islam open to the contemporary world. The Qatari-based revivalist Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who is still with us, even though he was born in 1926, he invokes Ibn Taymiyyah's utilitarianism and political pragmatism to encourage Muslims to engage constructively in democratic and pluralist societies. Muslims should seek justice and the common good to the best of their abilities, even in societies ruled by unbelievers. To conclude, Ibn Taymiyyah was both fecund and polarizing in his own lifetime and remains so today. Fecund means very productive. He produced a huge amount of work. So Ibn Taymiyyah was both highly productive and polarizing. In other words, he divided people. People, in my experience, tend to either love Ibn Taymiyyah hugely or they hate him. And he remains so to this day. His life and writings continue to inspire Muslims seeking a distinctively ethical vision of Islam, grounded in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. His criticisms of Asharism, Ibn al-Arabi, Shi'ism, Christianity, and shrine religion still stoke tensions within the Muslim community and beyond. Whether as boon or as bane, Ibn Taymiyyah is playing a key role in the ongoing negotiation of what Islam means in today's world, obviously. That's probably enough. This is, I give this book 10 out of 10. I've read a lot of academic books. This one is good because it's relatively easy to read. The later chapters, where he really goes into theology, God in creation, and so on, are much more difficult than the earlier chapters on Islamic law and worship. And the later chapters that for me are the most meaty and the most interesting. Just one final point for my own interest is I only realized the other day that Ibn Taymiyyah lived at exactly the same time as Thomas Aquinas, or Saint Thomas Aquinas is probably the greatest thinker in the Catholic tradition in the West, along with perhaps St. Augustine. And they were actually lived at the same time. And what I find fascinating is that Augustine, who, not Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, who for a time taught at the University of Paris, caused great scandal and condemnation in his own lifetime for trying to bring in Aristotle's thought, Aristotelian ethics, Hellenistic philosophy, in other words, and incorporate that within Catholicism to articulate an understanding of the Catholic faith for his day. And he was roundly condemned by the church for a time. Later on, and especially after his death, of course, he was highly, highly praised as a great thinker and is now, of course, a doctor of the church. I mean, he is he's the epitome of Catholic theology. And what's interesting is Ibn Taymiyyah, who lives exactly the same time, also grappled with Hellenistic philosophy, but rejected it. He root and branch. He said, no, we must have nothing with this, with reason and philosophy as being the foundation of our understanding of faith. No, the foundation of our faith is the Quran and the Sunnah as understood by the Sahaba. And he, even though he sometimes used their language to refute them, he absolutely rejected Greek philosophy as a foundation for Islamic theology and epistemology. So these two absolutely giant figures in global civilization, Aquinas and Ibn Taymiyyah, lived at the same time, interacted with the same issues, how to express their faith in their own time, particularly vis-a-vis the inherited Greek philosophy, which was so powerful, had a big impact on Judaism, by the way. It's a different subject. In Judaism, largely the Jewish people, Maimonides, of course, accepted Greek philosophy, along as did Thomas Aquinas, but and as did the Asherites, of course, famously the big major school at that time. But Ibn Taymiyyah rejected it root and branch as an innovation and as fundamentally incompatible with a faith based on revelation and reason. So in a sense, for me, Ibn Taymiyyah is like a Protestant, if I can use this term, whereas the Asherites are more like Catholics. Very controversial analogy, but for those who understand these issues, you get what I mean, I think. Enough for now. Until next time.